Hi everybody, Merry Christmas. This is my political science capstone and it is over the Bolivian water wars of 2000 and neoliberalism. At the end of capstone there's usually a panel for questions, so if any of you have questions for me, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. If you don't have any questions, that's totally fine. Thank you guys so much for supporting me, for being there for me, and wanting to listen to me speak for 10 minutes. And I hope that you all had a wonderful holiday and a happy new year. Thank you. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, my name is Katie and my project is called El Agua es Vida, Neoliberalism and Protest in the Bolivian Water Wars. So the research I've conducted is over neoliberalism and protest with a specific look at the Bolivian water wars of 2000. The research question I have articulated is how can we understand the relationship between neoliberalism and rebellion, and why must the former be followed by the latter? I have always had a particular interest in rebellion and protests, and as we read into neoliberalism, I noticed that neoliberal and neocolonial tendencies were promptly followed by uproar from the people who had fallen victim to them. Neoliberalism truthfully has become like a plague. Protest and rebellion and revolution notably bring people together in pursuit of change, be that with violence or not. If protest can be used as a fruitful means to overturn the stakes that neoliberalism has left in society, then this becomes a significant means of resistance and hopefully change. This leads me to my argument. I propose that a people's revolt is the best method to combat neoliberalism and its side effects, with the revolt being an avenue for the commons to survive past neoliberal corruption. I have conducted a case study that examines the 5-month-long protests that took place in Cochabamba, Bolivia, following the city's water privatization by the Bechtel Corporation. I have examined evidence of this study using the 2010 film También la lluvia, personal accounts, and news that came from Bolivia and the world during the time period of the protests. However, I'd first like to give a background on the water wars and their connection to neoliberalism. Bolivia is a landlocked nation in South America whose population is largely indigenous or of mixed indigenous ancestry. Following the end of decades-long military dictatorships in 1982, Bolivia's economy was in shambles. The government turned to the World Bank for assistance. For 20 years, this saw many public industries in Bolivia go private. Fast forward to 1997, Bolivia has made the decision to privatize the water system of Cochabamba and what they claim to be an effort to expand access to water, as most of the poor indigenous populace did not have access to the current system. The former state agency of SEMAPA was auctioned off to Aguas del Tunari, a consortium whose primary ownership was Bechtel Corporations, a company from California, and United Utilities out of London. The legality of this privatization was solidified by Law 2029, passed by the Bolivian government, verifying the contract. However, this same law gave a monopoly to Aguas del Tunari over all water resources. Community wells were shut down, meters were placed on rainwater collection, and water rates were increased by 35%. For a poor community already struggling financially, this hefty increase was too much. The group known as La Coordinadora, or Coordinator for the Defense of Water and Life, was created to raise awareness and fight against this new law. From December 1999, with a large boost in January 2000, through April 18, 2000, when protests led by Machina's Oscar Olivera and farmer Omar Fernandez ousted the Bechtel Corporation from Bolivia, unrest raged on. Most notable is the murder of 2 people, one of which was a high school boy named Victor Hugo Daza, who was shot by Bolivian Army Captain Robinson Iriarte La Fuente, and the wounding of several others by soldiers on April 9, 2000. The protesters were met with intense police brutality and violence from the military. With all of this being said, how do these protests tackle the neoliberal beast, and why was this the best means of fighting back? In También la lluvia, a line repeated throughout the film is El agua es vida, water is life. It is communicated in the movie that simply speaking to the water company isn't enough. There is a scene in particular that shows people from Aguas del Tunari locking up a community well. A woman on her own tries to stop them, explaining that the water is for the community, for their children. Individually, she is ignored, but as more people collected around the commotion, the lock was removed, and the water workers were forced back into their vehicle. This scene is symbolic of the protest as a whole. The only way Bechtel was ousted was through their collective resistance by the community in protection of their commons, their life, their water. This is not the only scene from the movie that is representative of the water wars and the exploitation of the poor indigenous community. One of the main characters, Daniel, is depicted as a leader of the community and the protest. Through the combination of three scenes, we are shown the escalation of violence that protesters are met with, the physical state of Daniel. In the first protest scene, he was punched in the face by police. This left a mark that needed to be covered. The second scene resulted in Daniel being jailed and beaten badly. The final protest scene is the climax. This time, Daniel's daughter has been injured by the military and is bleeding out, though she does live and recover. The importance of showing the growing intensity of the protests is to allow the viewer to understand that in the water wars, despite the dangers they were faced with, the community never halted their actions. They fought and fought until the Californian corporation that had infiltrated their community was forced out, tail tucked. As I mentioned before, my second piece of key evidence came from the news and personal accounts during the time period of the protest. One account I found particularly impactful was a first-hand experience from Jim Schultz, the director of the Democracy Center, who was living in Cochabamba, Bolivia, when the fight against the water companies began. In his accounts, he speaks of how this collective resistance was more than just words, how intricate and effective they were in ousting the neoliberal expedition. Schultz recalls February 4th, when the people of Cochabamba woke up to over 1,000 heavily armed police officers in the city square. This came after President Banzer declared congregation in the city center to be illegal, holding on to the contract his government had made with Bechtel. The square became a war zone. Schultz notes that people from every background, rich and poor and old and young, stood their ground fighting with rocks and slingshots against tear gas, riot shields, and batons. Cocaleros, or coca farmers, taught people how to soak bandanas in vinegar and place baking soda under their eyes to combat the effects of the tear gas. Those who could not find the square opened their doors to the protesters in the streets, offering food, water, and medical care to those in need of it. Schultz wrote that over 175 people were injured within 2 days, but in the end, the people won a small victory. The government vowed to roll back rates for 6 months. This was not the end of these protests, but at the present moment, it was enough. For my final piece of key evidence, I wanted to highlight Oscar Olivera, the importance of his leadership, and some words he shared about Aguas del Tunari and their neoliberal attempt at claiming the water of Cochabamba. In an interview from 2006, Olivera reflected on the events that occurred during those 5 months. He said, Bechtel, a large multinational, came to Cochabamba with the intention of privatizing water. Its aim was to profit greatly from the water. People were deeply opposed to their aims, and after major demonstrations, the company was made to leave Bolivia. This resistance was important not only because it reinforced the idea that water could not be traded like a commodity, but also because there was clear opposition to the wider neoliberal privatization models. As I mentioned before, Olivera was a machinist, a former shoe factory worker who was president of the Cochabamba Federation of Factory Workers. He grew up in a poor family, and when the fight for water began, he did what he felt he needed to do for the people and the families in both the urban and rural communities. He says that in Bolivia, water is viewed as a collective, a human right. This stems from the beliefs of the indigenous people who call the country home. Olivera says that this is what mobilized the people to fight Bechtel. They were fighting for their livelihoods. It was the only response they could have to save such a precious resource. It was the only language that these corporations of greed could understand. In Cochabamba, neoliberalism sunk its claws into the framework and lives of the community of people and that it didn't foresee fighting back. The commons is valuable, more than any amount of money ever could be. The commons means the survival of hundreds of people. The Bolivian water war sends this message that people will fight by any means necessary to protect their life. In my thesis, I contend that protests are the best way to fend off neoliberalism, but in Cochabamba, it was the only way. As I conclude, I would like to offer a final quote from Wendy Brown on neoliberalism. She says, "The existence of society and the idea of the social and intelligibility, its harboring of stratifying powers, and above all, its appropriateness as a site of justice and the commonwealth, is precisely what neoliberalism set out to destroy conceptually, normatively, and practically. Unfortunately for neoliberalism, the people, the society they so fervently seek to destroy fights back. Just look at Cochabamba. Resistance was consistent and continuing. The crowds were relentless, never quieting or ceasing. These people gave everything they had for 5 months straight because they didn't have any other choice. Nothing else they could do would have driven privatization out. They were charging them for their own water. Neoliberalism doesn't respect existence, therefore we must expect resistance." I would like to take a second to express my gratitude to some important people. First, thank you, Dr. Mariotti, for your guidance and patience as I slowly developed my ideas. Thank you to my beautiful family for their support and care. Thank you to my amazing classmates and friends who listened to my ideas and worries. I'd like to throw a particular shout out to Cassidy. I would not have made it through this semester without you. Thank you to my other wonderful poli-sci professors who fostered my growth and encouraged me to push on. Lastly, a special thanks to my super cool advisor, Dr. Selbin, for inspiring little freshman Katie and unintentionally convincing me to drop my bio major for poli-sci. Honestly, it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Thank you.